She was not hiding. Hiding was for children who thought it would work. From her spot on the top stair, Tilly was waiting, listening to the muffled thunder of his voice and the high, thin sound of her mother's pleading. The $5 bill in her pocket, a stolen thing folded into a perfect square, was not a prayer but a payment. The rain didn't bother her. It slicked the alley walls with a sheen like old oil and turned the city's breath into a cold mist. Each drip from the rusted fire escape above was a tick of a clock she had set in her own mind. She'd seen him once before, a flicker in the space between streetlights, a silhouette that was too tall, too still. Others hurried past that particular dark corner by the abandoned butchery, their shoulders hunched, their instincts screaming a language they no longer understood. Tilly had stopped. She had watched. She had understood perfectly. Now, she moved toward that same darkness, not with the shuffling fear of the others, but with the quiet purpose of a key seeking its lock. Her small sneakers made no sound on the wet pavement. The world was full of noises she had learned to tune out. The distant wail of a siren, the clatter of a dumpster lid, the angry shouts from a third-floor window. They were just static. The only sound that mattered was the one that wasn't there, the utter silence that pooled at the end of the alley. It was a heavy, dense quiet, a sound that had weight and absorbed all other noises into it. That was where he would be. The smell hit her first, not rot or decay, but something cleaner and colder. The scent of a deep cellar, of turned earth and something metallic, like an old coin held too long in a sweaty palm. He was there, exactly as she knew he would be. He didn't lean against the wall so much as he was part of its shadows, a man-shaped tear in the fabric of the night. His clothes were dark and old-fashioned, the kind she'd seen in black and white pictures, but they weren't dusty. They were immaculate. Tilly stopped 10 feet away. This was the proper distance for a business meeting. Her heart did not beat any faster. Fear was a useless thing. It made you clumsy. It made you cry. It made you weak. She had discarded it a long time ago, packed away with the dolls whose plastic eyes she had methodically pushed in. For a full minute, he did not move. He simply watched her, and she felt his gaze not as a threat, but as an assessment. It was like the way the doctor looked at the chart on his clipboard, a clinical and distant curiosity. Tilly did not fidget. She did not call out. She just waited, her small hands clenched into fists in the pockets of her thin jacket. Finally, his head tilted, a slow, unnatural motion that seemed to unspool the shadows around him. When he spoke, his voice wasn't a growl or a hiss. It was smooth and low, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. "You are very far from your crib, little bird." Tilly pulled one hand from her pocket, unfolding her fingers to show the small, wrinkled $5 bill resting on her palm. It was all the money she had. It was all the money in the house. "I need to hire you." A low chuckle, a sound without warmth, echoed in the narrow space. The shadow detached itself from the wall, resolving into a man of impossible height and stillness. He moved toward her without the sound of footsteps, a gliding, predatory grace that should have sent her scrambling back into the light. Tilly held her ground. "Hire me," he purred, stopping just beyond arm's reach. His face was a pale sculpture of sharp angles and ancient amusement. His eyes were not red, but black, so black they seemed to drink the meager light. "And what service do you imagine I provide?" "You're a monster," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a job qualification. "I've seen you. You hunt things. Bad things." "I hunt what I please," he corrected, his voice dropping, taking on an edge of menace that was meant to make her blood run cold. He leaned down, bringing his face closer to hers. The air temperature plummeted. "Sometimes I hunt little birds who wander into my nest. Sometimes I break their wings and drink their songs." Tilly did not blink. She had seen worse faces than his. She saw one every night in her own home, twisted with rage and cheap whiskey. This creature's face was clean. It was honest. "He's a bad thing," she stated, her voice flat and small, but unwavering. "My father." The man, vexed, straightened up, a flicker of something new in his dark eyes. It wasn't pity. It was interest, a genuine, unsettling curiosity. "Your father," he repeated, tasting the word. And what has this father done to merit my attention? Tilly raised her chin slightly. She didn't need to list the offenses. The faded yellow bruise on her cheekbone, peeking from beneath her dark hair, was a more eloquent invoice than any words she could offer. The way she held herself, with a rigid stillness born of expecting a sudden blow, was its own testimony. "He hurts my mother," she said. "He hurts me." Vex was silent for a long moment, studying her. He looked at the money on her palm, then back at her face. "Children come to me in their nightmares," he murmured, his voice a silken threat. "They beg for their parents. They cry for the light. They offer me sweets and toys to leave them be." "I don't have any candy," Tilly said, her patience thinning. The transaction was simple. She had the payment. He had the skill set. "I don't want you to leave us alone." She took a small, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between them. Her gaze was locked on his. "I want you to hurt him. I want you to make him feel small. I want you to break him like he breaks her favorite dishes, and I want him to know it was me." The amusement vanished from Vex's face, replaced by a profound, unnerving stillness. He looked at this tiny, fierce child with her old eyes and her complete absence of fear, and for the first time in centuries, Lord Oleron Vex was genuinely impressed. This was not a plea for salvation. This was a contract for revenge, offered by a client who knew exactly what she was buying. He smiled, a slow parting of thin lips that revealed the pearlescent tips of his fangs. It was not a comforting sight, but it was a smile of agreement, of partnership. With a delicacy that seemed impossible for his long, pale fingers, he plucked the $5 bill from her hand. The paper felt like nothing in his grasp. "The fee is acceptable." He folded the bill once, twice, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. The deal was sealed. His smile widened, a terrible and magnificent thing. "As you command, little mistress." The title settled over her not like a joke, but like a coronation. It was right. It was earned. She gave him a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement. Her work here was done. She turned and walked back toward the mouth of the alley, the cold rain no longer feeling quite so cold. When she reached her own front door, the shouting had stopped. That was worse. The silence after the storm was always the most dangerous part. She pushed the door open a crack. Her mother was crumpled on the floor by the sofa, weeping into her hands. Her father, Gareth, stood over her, his back to the door. He was breathing heavily, his thick shoulders heaving. He turned as Tilly stepped inside, his face flushed and ugly with rage. "Where have you been?" he snarled, his eyes fixing on her. He saw her rain-soaked hair, her defiant stillness. He saw another thing that refused to bend to his will. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his hand raised. Tilly didn't flinch, didn't even brace for it. She simply watched him come. The blow was fast and hard, a backhand that snapped her head to the side and sent a spray of blood from her nose. She stumbled, but didn't fall, catching herself on the arm of a chair. A coppery heat filled her mouth. Her mother cried out, a strangled, useless sound. Tilly straightened up slowly. She felt no pain. It was just pressure, just Ada. She looked past her father, past her weeping mother, and stared at the dark window that reflected the room. In her mind, she was no longer speaking to the pathetic, panting man in front of her. She was speaking to her new employee. She calmly wiped the smear of blood from her upper lip with the back of her hand, her eyes cold and clear and full of terrible purpose. Make it hurt. The house looked smaller. She remembered it as a giant's cavern, a place of echoing footsteps and doors that slammed with the finality of thunder. Now, standing on the cracked concrete path, it was just a house. Wood and glass and peeling paint. A box. Her box. Lord Vex stood behind her, a column of stillness in the encroaching twilight. He did not breathe. Tilly could feel the absence of it, a pocket of vacuum in the otherwise living air. He had followed her from the park, his long strides easily keeping pace with her short ones, a silent, tailored shadow that blotted out the streetlights as they passed. He hadn't offered his hand. He hadn't spoken. He understood this was her threshold to cross. The $5 bill was gone from her pocket, but she could still feel its weight, a phantom currency that had purchased this silence, this absolute potential. She reached into the pocket of her thin coat, her fingers closing around the cold, familiar brass of the key. Gareth always left one under the loose brick by the wilted rose bush. He called it an emergency key. He was not wrong. Her small fingers, clumsy with cold, fumbled with the lock. For a moment, a flicker of old frustration, the kind she felt when she couldn't reach the cereal box or tie her own shoes. But it passed. This was a mechanical process, not a trial. The lock clicked, a sound disproportionately loud in the quiet street. It was the sound of a contract being unsealed. She pushed the door inward. The air that rolled out to meet them was thick and familiar. The sour ghost of last night's beer, the greasy tang of fried food, and beneath it all, the stale, anxious scent of her mother. It was the smell of unhappiness. For the first time, it did not make her stomach clench. It was simply data. Tilly stepped over the threshold, her worn sneakers making no sound on the grimy linoleum of the entryway. She walked 2 paces into the gloom of the hall and turned. Vex remained on the porch, his form framed perfectly in the doorway. The last of the day's light caught the silver at his temples, but his eyes were lost in shadow. He was waiting. Of course he was. He was a creature of rules, of etiquette far older than the rotting wood of this house. He could rend a man limb from limb, but he could not cross a threshold unbidden. It was one of the details she'd found most interesting in the book she'd smuggled from the library. She looked at him, this impossible being of night and power, and felt a sliver of something akin to pride. He was hers, a tool she had procured. "You can come in," she said. Her voice was small, but did not tremble. It carried the weight of a royal decree. He inclined his head, a gesture of profound, almost courtly respect, and stepped inside. The moment his polished shoe touched the linoleum, the atmosphere in the house curdled. The air grew heavy, colder. The faint hum from the refrigerator seemed to falter, and the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the window stilled, as if afraid to move. He brought the grave with him. Tilly closed the door behind him. The latch catching sounded like a cell door locking. She turned the deadbolt, a formality, but a satisfying one. From the living room, the television blared, a game show, a cacophony of forced laughter and synthetic bells. And then another sound, Gareth's voice, thick and slurred. "Corinne, where the hell is the remote? Did the brat take it again?" Tilly started walking toward the sound. Vex moved behind her, a whisper of expensive wool. She could feel his presence not as a threat, but as an immense pressure at her back, a promise. She passed the little side table in the hall, the one with the chipped ceramic lamp. She ran a finger through the thick dust on its surface, leaving a clean line. A memory surfaced. Her face pressed against the cool wood of the tabletop, hiding, while Garrett's heavy footsteps shook the floorboards. She remembered the spider web in the corner, how she had watched the spider with a detached fascination as it wrapped a struggling fly. An apprenticeship. She stepped into the archway of the living room. He was there, sprawled his armchair, a brown throne of cracked vinyl and stuffing poking through the seams. Gareth. His face was puffy, flushed with drink and anger. His eyes, small and mean, were scanning the room with rising irritation. Her mother, Corinne, stood by the television, wringing her hands, her body coiled with the familiar tension of a kicked dog. "I don't know, Gareth. I haven't seen it," her mother whispered, her voice a frayed thread. Garrett's eyes landed on Tilly. The irritation in them instantly hardened into something uglier. "There you are. Where have you been? Your mother's been worried sick." He made a show of it, a performance for an invisible audience. He had to be the concerned father before he could be the judge and executioner. Tilly didn't answer. She just stood there, watching him. Her stillness seemed to unnerve him more than any backtalk ever could. "Answer me when I talk to you, girl," he roared, leveraging himself forward in the chair. The springs groaned in protest. Sneaking around, God knows where. You need to be taught a lesson. He was about to get up. She knew the sequence of movements by heart. The grunt, the heave, the way he'd steady himself on the arm of the chair before taking that first, purposeful step. Corinne saw it too. She flinched, a tiny, aborted movement. "Gareth, please. She's just a child." "I'll teach her," he snarled, his focus entirely on Tilly. It was time. Tilly felt a profound calm settle over her. The game show noise, her mother's whimpering, the smell of the room. It all faded into a distant hum. There was only the target, sitting in his throne, and the weapon standing behind her. She raised her right hand, her arm straight, and pointed a single, small finger directly at Gareth Vane. It was not a gesture of accusation. It was an instruction. For a fractional second, nothing happened. Gareth stared at her finger, a confused, contemptuous sneer forming on his lips. "What? You think you're—" He never finished the sentence. Vex moved. It wasn't a movement that could be easily described in terms of walking or running. It was a cancellation of distance. One moment he was a tall, dark shape in the hallway behind Tilly. The next he was beside the armchair, his hand clamped around Gareth's throat. The sound of Gareth's breath being cut off was a wet, shocking gurgle. The television's laughter track chose that exact moment to erupt, a grotesque counterpoint to the sudden, violent silence in the room. Gareth's eyes bulged. His hands, big and meaty, flew up to claw at the impossibly strong grip on his neck. His face, already flushed, began to turn a shade of deep plum. He kicked his legs, his boots drumming a frantic, useless rhythm against the worn carpet. Corinne screamed, a thin, reedy sound that was swallowed by the sheer presence of what was happening. Who are you? Get off him!" Vex paid her no mind. His attention, Tilly noted with approval, was solely on the task she had assigned him. He held Gareth up with one hand, lifting him slightly from the chair, the man's feet scraping helplessly for purchase. Then, with his other hand, he reached down and took hold of Gareth's right arm. Tilly watched, her expression placid. She remembered that arm. She remembered the sting of it against her cheek, the dull thud of it against her mother's back. She remembered the big, ugly watch he wore, how the metal of it was always cold when it hit. Vex looked at the arm as a carpenter might look at a piece of wood. He found the elbow. There was a sound. Not a crack, but a thick with a wet snap, like a bundle of dry sticks being snapped in half over a knee. Gareth's scream was choked off by the grip on his throat, but his body convulsed, a wild, thrashing agony. The arm now hung at an angle that was fundamentally wrong, a puppet's limb with a broken string. Vex was not finished. He released the broken arm and took hold of the left one. He paused. He turned his head just enough to look at Tilly. His eyes, now visible in the flickering light of the television, were not frenzied or monstrous. They were calm, professional. They held a question. Is this sufficient? Shall I continue? It was in that moment that the last piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Gareth. His struggling lessened. The terror in his eyes shifted, migrating from the impossibly strong man holding him to the small, silent child standing in the archway. The monster wasn't the one breaking his bones. The monster was the one giving the orders. His gaze, wide with disbelief and a new, more profound kind of horror, locked onto his daughter. Tilly held his gaze. She did not feel pity. She did not feel hatred. She felt an accountant's satisfaction. A ledger was being balanced. The debt was being paid, in full with interest. "Tilly," Gareth rasped, the name a bubble of bloody air forced past Vex's grip. "Tilly, please." She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. The service was not yet complete. Vex, taking this as his cue, addressed the left arm. Another pop, louder this time. A fresh wave of agony racked Gareth's frame. He went limp, consciousness starting to flee from the overwhelming pain. Vex did not let him fall. He held the broken man aloft, waiting. "Stop." Corinne finally found her voice again, a raw shriek of denial. She stumbled forward, her eyes wild, not looking at her husband, but at her daughter. "Tilly, what is this? What have you done?" She rushed towards Tilly, but not to attack her. Her instincts, twisted and broken by years of abuse, were still fundamentally maternal. She reached Tilly and did the only thing she knew how to do. She tried to shield her. She clapped a trembling hand over Tilly's eyes. "Don't look, baby, don't look at this," she sobbed, her body shaking. "It's okay, Mommy's here, just close your eyes." The hand was warm, damp with sweat. It smelled of her mother's fear, a scent as familiar to Tilly as her own. It pressed against her face, trying to force a darkness on her that she did not want. It was an insult. It was a relic of a world that no longer existed, a world where she was the victim, the one who needed protecting. A world she had paid $5 to burn to the ground. Tilly reached up with her small hand and calmly, firmly, pushed her mother's hand away from her face. She did not shove it. She moved it aside with the quiet authority of someone brushing away a cobweb. Her eyes, clear and cold, met her mother's terrified, uncomprehending gaze. The game show on the television chattered on, its audience applauding a contestant's hollow victory. The only other sound was Gareth's ragged, whimpering breaths. "No, Mommy," Tilly said, her voice perfectly steady, perfectly clear. "I want to watch." Corinne stared at her, her mouth falling open. The last vestiges of her reality crumbled. The hand she had tried to use as a shield fell limply to her side. She was not looking at a child. She was not looking at her daughter. She was looking at the architect of this nightmare. The years of Garrett's cruelty had hammered Tilly into something hard and sharp, and now Corinne was finally seeing the edge. Tilly turned her attention back to the main event. Vex had lowered Gareth slightly, letting his feet touch the floor. The man's broken body was a ruin, held up only by the vampire's relentless grip. He was conscious just barely. His eyes were glazed with pain, but they were fixed on Tilly, pleading. He finally understood. He wasn't being punished by a monster. He was being judged by his daughter. Vex was a study in patience. His posture hadn't changed. He was an instrument of her will, awaiting the next command. He moved his free hand to Gareth's leg. He looked at Tilly. The question was there again, silent but clear. The legs now? Shall we unmake him completely? Tilly considered it. She remembered being locked in her room, listening to his heavy, angry footsteps pacing in the hall. The sound of those footsteps had been the soundtrack to her fear for years. The idea of silencing them forever held a certain appeal, a definitive final quiet. She thought about the $5, the crumpled bill she had smoothed out so carefully. It had felt like so much money, a fortune. She had wanted to get her money's worth. Value for services rendered. Was this enough? Had the debt been paid? Gareth made a noise, a low, pathetic moan. It was the sound of utter defeat. The sound she had dreamed of hearing. The sound of powerlessness. Vex's fingers tightened on Gareth's kneecap. The man's body tensed, anticipating the next wave of unimaginable pain. Vex's gaze did not waver from Tilly. He was waiting for her signal, her judgment. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Life or continued meticulous destruction. The entire horrific tableau hung, suspended in that moment, balanced on the whim of a 6-year-old girl standing in her living room, watching with the clinical interest of a scientist observing an experiment. The world was reduced to the sound of scraping. Fingernails on wood, a desperate, pathetic rhythm that set Tilly's teeth on edge. Her father, Gareth, was a slug leaving a trail of blood and spit across the floorboards. His body, once a mountain of roaring rage, was now just a sack of broken meat dragging itself toward the glint of salvation under the sofa. The revolver, his last little toy. Tilly watched from the doorway, a small, still shadow in the chaos. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the bitter scent of her father's fear. It was a better smell than the stale beer and sweat she was used to. Her mother, Corinne, was a statue of terror huddled by the overturned coffee table, her sobs like the leaking of a faulty pipe. Irrelevant. A blur of motion, silent as a falling shadow, resolved itself into Lord Vex. He stood over Gareth, his immaculate leather coat unstained by the violence. He didn't look down with anger or pity, but with the detached interest of a biologist observing a specimen. Gareth's fingers, trembling and slick with his own blood, stretched. 1 inch, half an inch. They brushed the cold steel of the gun's grip. A final, gasping surge of hope animated his broken form. Then came the sound, not a stomp, It was a precise, deliberate application of pressure. A sound like a bundle of dry twigs being snapped in half, wetly. It echoed in the sudden, ringing silence that followed. Gareth's scream was a choked, strangled thing, his mouth wide open, but producing only a high, thin whistle as his hand imploded under Vex's polished boot. The bones in his knuckles, his wrist, his palm, they were all just gravel in a bag of skin now. Vex didn't even glance at the ruin of flesh and bone he'd created. His eyes, ancient and black, found Tilly's. They held no malice, only a question. His voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "Shall I end him, little queen?" The words hung in the air, a formal offering. A transfer of power so absolute it made the air crackle. Her mother's weeping hitched, a sound of pure, uncomprehending horror. Corinne was looking at Vex, at the monster, not understanding that the real monster was the small girl in the pink pajamas. Tilly took a step forward, then another. The soft patter of her slippers on the wood was the only sound in the room now. She walked past the vampire, her loyal instrument, and stood over the whimpering, writhing thing that had been her father. He was trying to cradle his shattered hand with his good one, his body convulsing with a pain she couldn't imagine and didn't care to. His eyes, wild and bloodshot, looked up at her. They were finally full of the terror he had so enjoyed putting in hers. She looked down at the architect of her bruises, the composer of her nightmares. She saw the pathetic creature he truly was, stripped of his volume and his fists. The $5 she'd paid had been a bargain. "Dead is too easy," Tilly said. Her voice was small, clear, and utterly devoid of heat. It was a statement of fact. Dead is quiet. I don't want quiet anymore. She tilted her head, a flicker of an idea taking root. An idea born from years of being told to sit still, to be invisible, to make herself small. An idea of perfect, unending justice. "I want him to stay," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I want him to watch." She took a small, deliberate breath, feeling the power Vex had lent her, a cold, heavy thing settling in her chest. It was hers to command. She was the one holding the leash now. She focused on her father, on the trembling mass of him on the floor, and she gave her first true order. Her whisper was barely audible, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. "Be a chair, Daddy." It did not happen all at once. First, a tremor seized him, a violent, full-body spasm that was not born of pain, but of compliance. A grotesque puppet dance. His good hand flew to the floor, palm flat. The other, the mangled one, was forced to do the same, a wet slap of broken bones against the wood that made him shriek. Then his back began to arch. It rose unnaturally, the vertebrae popping like firecrackers in a muffled string. His muscles bunched and locked, straining against their own design. A low, guttural moan tore from his throat as his spine curved into a mathematically perfect 90-degree angle. His torso now a flat, rigid plane parallel to the floor. His legs were next. They bent, his knees cracking loudly as they were forced under him, his thighs and shins locking into the shape of 4 solid legs. He was fighting it. She could feel the pathetic sparks of his will pushing back against her command, and it was amusing. It was like a fly struggling in a web. His face, pressed into the cheap shag carpet, was a mask of agony and disbelief, his muffled screams vibrating through the floorboards. Sinew stretched past its limits, joints locked into place with grinding finality. He was being remade, unmade. Tilly watched, her expression one of clinical curiosity. She was an artist, and this was her clay. She made a minor adjustment with her mind, forcing his head up just enough so his eyes, bulging with horror, could see her. He had to watch. That was part of the price. Finally, the screaming stopped, replaced by the ragged, strained sound of breathing. He was still, a piece of furniture made of flesh, bone, and regret. A monument to his own failure. The silence that descended upon the room was heavier than any sound had ever been. It was a thick, syrupy quiet, broken only by the shuddering gasps of her mother and the agonized, rhythmic breathing of the man who was a chair. The air smelled of ozone and victory. Tilly stood for a long moment, simply observing her creation. The lines were good. The form was stable. It was a masterpiece of humiliation. For the first time in her life, the house felt truly hers. The shadows were no longer places to hide. They were extensions of her will. The creaks in the floorboards were no longer signs of his approach. They were the house settling into its new, proper order. She turned and walked into the kitchen. The linoleum was cool under her slippers. She opened the refrigerator, the familiar hum and soft yellow light a stark contrast to the Gothic tableau in the other room. She reached past the wilting lettuce and the half-empty carton of milk, her fingers closing around her prize, a foil-topped juice box. Apple, her favorite. She took it back to the living room. Her mother was still frozen in the corner, her face drained and gray, like wet ash. Her eyes tracked Tilly, but there was no recognition in them, only a bottomless animal terror. She was looking at her daughter and seeing the architect of a horror her mind could not process. Tilly didn't care. Her mother had been furniture for years, a weeping, useless thing that never stood in the way of the monster. Now she was just another object in Tilly's room. Tilly calmly unwrapped the tiny plastic straw, the crinkling sound echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. She punctured the foil circle with a satisfying little pop. She walked over to the chair. Her father's back was a broad, flat surface, the fabric of his flannel shirt stretched tight over the rigid muscle beneath. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the frantic, trapped energy of his life force. She placed a hand on him. He flinched, a full-body tremor, but the shape held. Her command was absolute. With no more ceremony than a child climbing onto a stool, she clambered up onto his back. She settled herself in the center, her small legs dangling over his side. He was warm. He was steady. The best seat in the house. She took a long sip of her juice box. The apple flavor was sweet and sharp on her tongue. She began to swing her legs, a gentle, rhythmic motion, the heels of her slippers thumping softly against her father's ribs. Thump, 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 a new heartbeat for the house. Lord Vex had not moved. He stood like a sentinel carved from night, his presence a comforting weight in the room. He had kept his promise. He had delivered the tool she needed. Tilly looked over at him, the juice box held in her small hand. "Good job," she said, her voice clear and steady. A slow, genuine smile touched the vampire's lips. It was not a predatory smile, but one of deep, profound respect. He saw her not as a child, not as a victim, but as an equal, a peer. He inclined his head, a gesture that was less a servant's bow and more a king's acknowledgement of another sovereign. The deal was concluded. The new order was established. Tilly took another sip of juice, looking around the room. Her gaze passed over her catatonic mother, the shattered remains of the coffee table, and the dark stains on the floor. Everything was finally in its right place. The world was quiet. It was orderly. It was safe. The camera pans out, pulling away from the gruesome domestic scene. It drifts through the window, over the neatly trimmed lawn, and rises above the roof. From the outside, the house on 24 Cherry Tree Lane looks just like any other on the block. A warm light glows in the living room window, a perfect picture of suburban peace. Inside, the monster is a little girl, swinging her feet and finishing her juice. What happens when the abused finally takes the power they've always been denied? This story explores the terrifying reality that the victim does not always become the hero. Sometimes, to defeat a monster, you have to become something far, far worse. If you were captivated by this descent into darkness and the birth of a new kind of evil, please subscribe to our channel for more tales that dare to look into the abyss.